The International Monetary Fund predicts strong growth for Russia's economy this year. That's despite sanctions imposed for the invasion of Ukraine. European nations trail well behind Russia in the IMF forecast. So what's behind these figures? Do sanctions actually work? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Russia's invasion of Ukraine almost 2 years ago has been met with the harshest regime of sanctions ever imposed on a country. So Russia coming third behind India and China in the global growth forecast from the International Monetary Fund may surprise many. That's also after conscription into the army for large numbers of Russian workers and the hundreds of thousands who've fled the country since the war began. Despite all that, what's behind the optimistic forecast for Russia's economy? Do international sanctions actually work? Not just in Russia, but elsewhere. We'll be asking our guests this and lots more in a few moments. But first, a report from Katia Lopez-Hodayan.
It looks like 2024 will be a good year for Russia's economy. The International Monetary Fund predicts a 2.6% growth in Russian GDP. That's despite widespread sanctions aimed at crippling the Kremlin for invading Ukraine. But Russia's so-called war economy and military spending are driving much of the growth, raising questions on whether sanctions have become irrelevant.
We are resolved to continue imposing massive costs on Russia. Costs that will further isolate Russia from the international financial system and our economies.
And now, 2 years into the war, President Vladimir Putin has managed to get around some Western sanctions by using allies to obtain technology, such as computer chips needed for weapons to fight in Ukraine. Using so-called shadow ships is another way Russia is getting around EU sanctions, by passing the $60 per barrel price cap on oil exports by hiding the vessel's port of origin, ownership, and route. The move allows shipments to reach major customers such as China and India, keeping Russia's vital oil trade and income flowing. In contrast to Russia's expected growth, the IMF has downgraded Germany, Europe's strongest economy. High energy prices caused in part by sanctions on Russian oil and gas imports are fueling the fall. German leaders are defiant despite the risk of recession.
Germany has an international responsibility. We back Ukraine as the world's second largest financial supporter. Our contribution remains unchanged at above 0.6% of our economic output.
It's unclear if Russia can maintain predicted growth in the long term without its war economy. But the IMF figures are raising questions on whether sanctions designed to hurt Moscow have backfired. Katia Lopez-Hodayan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, Russia is one of several countries under international sanctions, but it tops the total. Figures collated by data specialists Castellum.ai for December show Russia faces almost 19,000 sanctions. Before the invasion of Ukraine, around 2,700 were in force. Trailing well behind Russia is Iran with almost 5,000. Syria faces just over 2,800 sanctions. North Korea is next with nearly 2,200. And then comes Russia's neighbour Belarus with almost 1,500. Next are Myanmar and then Venezuela. Sanctions against Russia have been imposed by countries including the US, the EU, the UK, Australia, Canada and Japan. All right, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Astana in Kazakhstan, we're joined by Chris Weaver, who is the Chief Executive of Macro Advisory. That's a strategic business consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. From the Norwegian capital, Oslo, we're joined by Arlen Bjortvedt, who's a sanctions expert who founded the country risk analysis company CoRisk. He also helped to write a recent report that investigated how Russian sanctions are being ignored. And from Washington, D.C., Anatol Lieven is the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And gentlemen, welcome to you all. Let's start with you then, Chris. What do you make of these optimistic growth forecast figures for Russia?
Well, they look optimistic, but in actual fact, what really those numbers show is that the economy is stabilized. It is largely being driven, but with a combination of military-industrial complex spending, which is having, of course, a big impact on the economy, and also the fact that incomes have been rising so strongly last year, and again are expected to this year, almost a double-digit real income growth, which is driving consumption. So it's those two factors that are supporting this, optimistic forecast. We expect between 2 to 2.5% growth, so not too dissimilar to the IMF. We expect that the government will come out with very strong numbers for 2023. For last year, the economy minister just recently said that he thinks the GDP for 2023 could actually have been 3.5 or even a little bit better. But it is very much down to the military-industrial complex spending and the recovery in consumption. It is not a reflection of kind of a broad economic recovery. It's not an indication of an economy that's seeing sustained growth across multiple sectors. It's a very specific reason, but it is supportable for several years, provided the oil tax income remains roughly where it is today.
Ireland European Commission Vice President Josep Borrell continues to insist that sanctions against Russia are working. But as we said at the beginning of the programme, it's nearly 2 years now since the Ukraine war began. And the sanctions were introduced shortly after. Are they working? Is Josep Borrell right?
Well, Adrian, they are working. As we all know from historical legacy, sanctions do not work like overnight. They take some time to start making their way. But what we see is that financial sanctions of Russia are really working. Russia has big problems getting hold of hard currency. They have trading problems, they have inflation in imports. And actually, what we've seen in our research is that, and this has not been very much noticed, but actually Russia's imports of the so-called critical list goods, or the 51 most war critical goods, has declined by 60% since December 2022. So December 22 was kind of the peak of Russia's imports. Both total imports and war critical imports have been more or less decimated since December 1 year ago. What we see in the long term, I think all economists agree that the long-term picture for Russia is not rosy. They have basically a long-term 0% growth. GDP is still lower than it was 10 years ago. There is a kind of decline in population, there's a decline in skills with migration and everything. But actually, even in the short term, we are seeing now what the IMF is actually kind of documenting is not economic growth, is spending growth. So basically what Russia is doing, they are taking money for their pensions fund. They've probably halved their pensions fund, and they're transferring that to public spending on security. And this has nothing to do with real organic economic growth. This is not sustainable. This is not something that will drive their economy into 2020, 25, 26, etc. This is a very short-term, more or less budgetary phenomenon, and it has nothing to do with economic growth.
Anatol, the sanctions were intended to undermine Russia's ability to fund its war in Ukraine. Are they doing that?
No, obviously not. Russian military production has increased hugely. They are out-competing the West when it comes to the production of artillery shells, for example, which is critical. But I think it's also worth noting that when it comes to regime change or even changing critical regime policies, sanctions have almost never worked. You read a long list of them going all the way back to Cuba now for more than 60 years, and they have not succeeded. The difference is that in those cases, they did do great damage to the economies concerned of Iran, Venezuela, and so on. Whereas in the case of Russia, they haven't done that. And I think there are other things to be noted here. The first is, of course, that economy over the past generation, the world economy, has become very different. China is now an economic superpower. As long as it is willing to go on buying Russian energy and trading with Russia and supplying Russia with various critical products, and as long as India, also a hugely growing economy, is willing to do that, the West's ability to strangle the Russian economy is colossally reduced, unless, of course, it were actually to impose a naval blockade on Russia, but that would be an act of war. The other thing I think to note is that what's happening in Russia has been called military Keynesianism. It recalls in certain respects the boom in America, which ended the Great Depression at the end of the 1930s as a result of colossally increased military spending. And that is a viable way of boosting the industrial economy, if, of course, you've got the resources from the sale of oil and gas to do that. The long-term question, I think, and this is something that Russian analysts are writing about a great deal now, is whether this can be turned into a sustainable state program of industrial development in other fields when the war ends, if it ever does. Now, of course, for that, we don't know whether this will be possible. But since so many Western predictions have proved false, predictions or, shall we say, hopes, I think it would be a mistake simply to assume a priori that Russia cannot do that.
Chris, what do you make of what Anatol was saying there? Do you agree that sanctions almost never work? And if they don't work, what should the West have done to hit Russia's capability to fund its military-industrial complex and its war against Ukraine?
Yeah, actually, can I just go back to one step and just to add to a comment that was made earlier? Russia is not funding the military spending, the budget, out of savings. It's running the budget deficit only about 1% last year, less than 1% this year. The critical element for the budget is the level of oil, gas, and other commodity exports, and they're holding up quite well. So it's not the case that Russia is burning through its stockpile of money and is going to end up in a difficult situation within the next couple of years. The financial reserves are more or less staying intact, and Russia is actually running down its debt. So its financial position right now, which is critically dependent on export volumes for sure, is remaining in quite a comfortable position. But in answer to your question about sanctions almost never work, well, they almost never work to deliver on what was the declared intention. In this case, the declared intention was to force Russia into a difficult economic situation so that it would force the Kremlin into rethinking its actions in Ukraine and to stopping its actions in Ukraine. And clearly that hasn't happened. The reason it hasn't happened is because Russia is such an important exporter or supplier of hydrocarbons and other materials which are in high demand in places like China and India and other Asian markets. And there's no sign of that letting up. Russia is offering a reduced discount now compared to what it was offering or had to offer in the first half of last year. Now the discounts are much smaller, and it has built up this shadow fleet and other ways of getting the products to the Asian customers and to be paid for it. So to that extent, yeah, for sure, Russia is not in the comfortable position of being able to diversify the economy and to grow and to handle all of the demographic issues that it was talking about before this conflict. But it is in a comfortable position in that it can pay its bills and fund the budget kind of requirements that it's now facing. And then one final point is in terms of the future. Clearly the situation remains that it is today. Russia will slip more and more into stagnation. The economy will become even more dependent on military-industrial complex. The narrative in Moscow, of course, is that that's not going to happen, and they're looking at cooperation with this expanded BRICS Plus format, which of course was added to with other countries from January this year. and where the intention of Russia and China is to bring even more countries into it in the next couple of years, and to use that format as an alternative, if you like, to what was a previous dependency and engagement with Western nations. It's far too early to say that that will work, or how long it will take to work. But there is a way forward that at least has been discussed, which has got some options. But meantime, the critical factor for Russia absolutely is what are the level of budget receipts from oil exports. That's critical.
Ireland, are European and US companies, indeed, entire nations perhaps, undermining the sanctions regime by circumventing them? And if so, what can be done to better enforce a sanctions regime once it's put into place?
So, Adrian, what we found in our research is, yes, European and Western, also US companies are circumventing sanctions of commodities, so sanctions of export of goods to Russia. Those goods will usually kind of find a way via third countries, via Turkey, via Kazakhstan, and other countries, and they will basically find a way to Russia. But what is working here are actually the financial sanctions. So what we see is that Russia, just amid a war, an intensive war, drastically reduced their imports of war critical goods, of the critical list goods. They have been more than halved since 1 year ago. And we think the reason for that is because Russia is having issues with hard currency. They're earning more or less. They have a lower exports. Gas prices has been decimated to only a fifth of what it was a year ago. And we see this kind of a decline in Russia's ability to import. So regardless of to which degree commodity sanctions work, we think that we have to look at the commodity sanctions in conjunction with the financial sanctions, and we see financial sanctions, the dollar sanction, the euro sanction, are probably working quite well to reduce Russia's abilities. So I think we all agree that kind of Russia's long-term economic development has been very bleak, very bad. But even in the short term, after this spending spree that we see up until the election in a month, we will probably see much clearer the erosion of Russian productive capacity below that kind of budgetary artificially surface that we see unfolding now.
Okay, I see Chris shaking his head. And Anatol, I'll come back to you in just a second. Let me just give Chris a moment to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I've read this in a few places. Obviously, the expectations that Russia is deliberately kind of ramming the economy with high levels of spending, all of which is going to come to an end after the election. And I just don't see that. One of the reasons why the economy has performed quite very well, like relatively well last year, continues, is because of the effectiveness of the state institutions, of the management of the economy. And they've been reasonably transparent. And we can cross-reference data with importers such as China and India, et cetera. So we just don't see that there is a cliff, in terms of spending. Russia, for example, even last year made 140 billion of trade surplus and almost 80 billion of current account surplus. And at the current oil price, there's no reason why that won't be repeated through this year. So we do not see a reduction in spending. We'd see it more even, if you like, through the year, unless the oil price collapses.
Okay, Anatol, if sanctions almost never work, as you said in your last answer, why are they still used? And what impact do they have upon the economies of countries that impose them? I'm thinking specifically here of Germany.
Yes, I mean, that is the critical question. I mean, this started with the United States, and it has progressively become a kind of declarative policy, especially on the part of the US Congress. It's a way that the Congress has signaled its displeasure or anger with a range of countries around the world, either for humanitarian reasons or because they are against America, or a combination of both. So it's, and of course, it's also the alternative to war. If for whatever reason you feel that you cannot, as you would have in the past, invaded Venezuela or Cuba and replace the governments there, then you impose sanctions on them. Same thing with Iran, same thing with Russia. If you're not prepared to fight, you try to do it by economic means. Now, if this, as I've said, was the equivalent of the British blockade of Germany in the First or Second World Wars, which cut off all German maritime trade, then it would work. But of course, we're not prepared to go there, not just because it would be an act of war against Russia, and not just because it would infuriate the Chinese, but it would also infuriate critical Western partners like India, who are so dependent on Western oil. So this is a policy which has become reflexive, automatic. I mean, the Congress often appears to be on autopilot over this. It's not necessarily a policy that has been seriously and systematically thought out. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something to be reconsidered. And of course, on Germany, you're absolutely right. It's like the old story. You don't have to run faster than the lion. You just have to run faster than me. And Russia is doing so much better than Germany. And it is a serious question now, with so much worried talk in Germany of deindustrialization, the collapse of the German industrial economy, whether in fact politically Germany can sustain its existing course, including that of sanctions against Russia.
A few minutes left. I want to get a couple more questions in. Chris, to you first. To what extent is it the ordinary people of Russia who are bearing the brunt of the West's sanctions against the country? And as far as their political support for President Putin, has it strengthened him?
Well, look, there's no obvious impact on people right now. I mean, I'm in and out of Russia a lot. I see the stores are full. The mechanisms for people to buy goods online from, say, fashion outlets that have left Russia are all fully available. There's I look at the streets of Moscow. It's not only that they're full of Chinese cars, but there are brand new Asian and European cars coming in through parallel imports. So there's as of now, there is no kind of obvious negative impact or any major impact on Russians, other than those who want to travel. It is clearly a lot more expensive for Russians to travel outside Russia, and it's more difficult to go to most places except down to the Middle East. But for the majority of Russians, I would say no, they haven't really noticed any impact on their lifestyle, other than perhaps there's more goods with a made in China label on them than maybe made in Germany. That was the case. In terms of support for the president, well, Russians historically support the state. Especially when there's time of trouble, as they say. And, the narrative in Russian media is that Russia is under attack by NATO, by the West, and that Ukraine is simply being used as the pawn in the middle, and that Russia is fighting against NATO. So people support the state and are quite nationalistic in that sense. To that extent, President Putin, as the president, gets the support by default. But I don't see at this stage any reason to assume that there will be any public protests, although it is worth mentioning that there is concern about a possible next round of mobilization. We are beginning to see some pushback against that, so the Kremlin will need to be careful not to make a misstep on mobilization as it did in September of 2022. But apart from that, I would have to say the situation in Russia today is actually quite stable.
Alan, we've talked a lot on the programme about commodity and financial sanctions designed to bring about political change. Is there any evidence to suggest that sanctions also work as a tool for bringing about a positive change as far as human rights are concerned?
Well, it did certainly in South Africa. If we go a few decades back, sanctions can work very much. We saw, for example, Iraq. They probably had too much effect and were kind of tuned down. But all our research shows that the sanctions of Russia are really working quite a lot. First, as I touched upon, the dollar and euro sanctions, the financial sanctions, reduce their ability to import and to trade, rise the cost of the war, the cost of import, cost of technology, and all of that. But I disagree with Chris as to the burden on ordinary Russian citizens. They are paying a very high price for the war. First of all, of course, the conscription and the war itself. But if you go outside of Moscow, you would see people dying from cold because of lack of heating and electricity. You'll see people's interest rates on loans have really increased a lot. Inflation has increased a lot. And even petrol in a country like Russia, prices has increased a lot. There is a lot of disturbance of the market mechanism. And actually, I think when the public spending spree is over after the election, when social and military or social spending is kind of relaxed again, you will see economic problems coming to the forefront, also for ordinary people.
We're almost out of time. Chris is shaking his head there. Chris, look, I've got about 30 seconds now. I wanted to get Anatol in. I'm sorry, Anatol, I might not get back to you, but Chris, quickly.
Look, three quick points. First of all, we do not see spending deteriorating after the election. We do not see any basis for that whatsoever. Secondly, 85% of Russia's trade is now conducted in currencies of BRICS countries, which includes now the UAE dirham, as well as the Chinese yuan. So yes, it has moved substantially away from the dollar and euro. And the third thing is, I was actually out in the regions last week. I do not see people dying from anything. It's normal.
Quickly, because the news doesn't wait for anyone, and that's coming up next. Anatol, just briefly.
Yes, I mean, actually, there's been a great redistribution of money to the Russian provinces. They're doing much better, the industrial zones. No, I mean, the war will continue and spending on the industrial economy will continue after the elections. This is not a political boost for the economy. It is a war boost.
All right, gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed to you all for taking part in the programme today. Chris Weaver, Arlen Bjortvedt and Anatol Lieven. As always, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this topic, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on X, our handle there, at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.